Welcome back to the CISA Exam Prep Series. Today in Domain 5, Part B, we're digging into security event management. Now, if Domain 5A was about building the defenses, this domain is about operating them. It covers the active, real-time processes of detection and response. And the exam will test your ability to evaluate these processes from an auditor's perspective, ensuring the organization can effectively identify and handle security incidents should they occur. We'll begin with the human element of security awareness and training. We'll then dig into common attack methods, security testing techniques, and the teams responsible for them, as well as the critical roles of monitoring with tools like a security information event management system. And we'll finish with the essential processes for incident response and evidence collection, including the importance of the chain of custody. Definitely some of my favorite security-related topics. It's the big finish. Let's dig in. And in Domain 5B, we'll be talking security event management. And while you may know me from my exam prep content here on YouTube, in my 9 to 5, I'm a cybersecurity strategist and a vCISO for a regional bank where I'm exercising my cybersecurity knowledge every day, like that which you'll find here on the CISA exam. More importantly, last year I helped thousands achieve cybersecurity certifications, like the CISSP, CCSP, and the Security Plus exams, and I'm bringing that proven formula to you here with the CISA exam. As with all my exam prep courses, you'll find a PDF copy of this presentation available for you in the video description to leverage in your exam preparation as you require. You'll also find a clickable table of contents available in the video description, and it should appear automatically on your YouTube video timeline. And this is the final installment in Domain 5, Protection of Information Assets, which is amongst the most heavily weighted on the exam. And in our series of 5 domains and 10 videos, this brings us to the 10th and final installment, the big finish. So let's look at Domain 5 from a syllabus perspective. Again, the focus is security event management. We have security awareness training and programs. There are 3 flavors of education you need to be aware of. Information system attack methods and techniques, security testing tools and techniques, security monitoring tools and techniques, security incident response management, and finally, evidence collection and forensics. So we'll begin with security awareness training and programs. At the most fundamental level, security really depends on people. It's not just about technology, and generally speaking, people are often considered the weakest link in information security due to negligence or ignorance. So our goal here is to change their behavior and foster a culture of good security practices where we transform people from the weakest link into our first line of defense. And if we think about email-borne attacks such as phishing and ransomware, it really becomes such an important goal. And from a learning perspective, we have to develop a structured approach moving from awareness into training and then into the deepest form of learning, education. And for the exam, you should know the difference between these 3. So let's talk about that for a moment. So in awareness training, we're changing behavior and creating that security culture. It answers the what. And we'll often do this 2 to 4 times a year where we're just educating our general user population about the current threats they face, such as the latest phishing attacks. Training is where we're teaching skills to perform a job role more securely. We're answering the how to do something. And in education, we're providing in-depth knowledge for our security professionals. This answers the why. So our audience here, awareness training is employees from day one. We want to train them from the moment we onboard. The training bucket, we're looking at specific functional areas related to the job, and in the education bucket, security professionals seeking deeper career expertise. In terms of methodology, awareness training is often passive learning. Video, newsletters, posters, phishing simulations. We'll sometimes do a live session. Training will be formal hands-on learning in instructor-led classes or self-paced sometimes. And education will be intensive learning. That might be university courses, seminars, research, or where we send our security folks off-site for extended sessions. From an auditor perspective, your job is to assess if the organization is applying the right level of learning to the right audience to achieve its security goals. And as an auditor, you have to verify that the program is based on a formal needs assessment, that we know what our objectives are. It has to consider the unique roles and responsibilities of the different groups. For example, our executive management, our IT staff, our developers, our end users. From an exam perspective, know that as an auditor, operational staff and system users are often the riskiest groups. They typically require a high degree of awareness training, and especially in that awareness bucket, repetition absolutely matters. So program implementation should be a continuous cycle. We define the scope, we select the staff, we identify our audience, we motivate our trainees, administer the program, and motivating trainees. We have to have folks who are, if they're not excited about awareness training or job-related training, they need to understand its importance. They need to be motivated to onboard this knowledge. We administer the program, we maintain this program over time, reassessing our needs over time, and occasionally we will evaluate that program and course correct or refine our approach and our methods where needed. But we also have to measure the efficacy of this training. So while return on investment is often not quantifiable, we can measure through some tangible metrics. For example, the reduced number of security incidents, increased reporting of suspicious events by employees, improved results from phishing simulation tests. In fact, in those phishing simulation reports, we'll often look to see how many employees reported the phishing simulation as a phishing email. And more people reporting tells us that our awareness training is making a difference. All right, let's move on to number 2, information system attack methods and techniques. So when it comes to fraudulent actions, the fraud triangle is a model for explaining the factors that cause someone to commit malicious or fraudulent acts. The first is motivation, a perceived financial or other need. It could be debt, it could be greed, it could be a grudge. Opportunity. So an opportunity might be weak internal controls or poor oversight of a process that allows the crime to be committed by an internal or external entity. Rationalization. The way fraudsters justify their crime to themselves. I was only borrowing it, the company owes me, the company deserves this. You should be familiar with the different types of attackers. There are hackers who explore systems to test limits, but not always with malicious intent. Crackers, on the other hand, break into systems with malicious intent. They are there to do harm, to do damage. Script kiddies use scripts and programs written by others to perform intrusions. These are low-skill, low-budget individuals. Insiders are employees or former employees who pose a significant threat due to their knowledge and authorized access. From a social engineering perspective, we're focused on the human element here. Phishing is the most common attack, attempting to acquire sensitive information by masquerading as a trustworthy entity. The 2 most common types of phishing attacks these days are spear phishing, which targets a specific organization or group, and I would say most phishing attacks today look like they are at least quasi-targeted to the industry, if not the organization. And then you have whaling, which targets high-value entities within the organization, typically senior executives, the big fish, so to speak. So common attacks, denial of service, which is an attack designed to make a machine or a network resource unavailable to its intended user. So it's resource disruption. A distributed denial of service, or DDoS attack, is denial of service launched from multiple compromised systems, typically a botnet. A man-in-the-middle attack is where an attacker secretly relays and possibly alters the communication between two parties who believe they are directly communicating. So essentially, if a user is communicating with a website, perhaps to make a transaction, to make a purchase, in that man-in-the-middle attack, that bad actor is intercepting that communication and redirecting, potentially altering and capturing information in the process. So there's malicious code or malware, and we have a few flavors of malware you should be familiar with. The Trojan horse, which is a program disguised as a useful application that performs malicious actions once it's executed. There's the logic bomb, which is code that will set off a malicious function when specified conditions are met, such as a specific date and time. Often you'll see these planted by disgruntled insiders to execute at a later date. A worm is a standalone program that replicates itself to spread to other computers, often exploiting a vulnerability to travel across networks. But that replication on its own is the defining characteristic. And then ransomware, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, malware that encrypts a victim's data and demands a ransom payment to restore access. And that brings us to security testing tools and techniques, a few concepts you'll want to be familiar with here. So security testing is a proactive effort to reveal flaws in security mechanisms and to verify that existing controls are working effectively. So you want to know the difference between a vulnerability assessment and a penetration test. So a vulnerability scan is where we run a vulnerability scanner and identify a list of known potential vulnerabilities, often without the underlying context of how those components are deployed and protected within the organization. A penetration test, on the other hand, attempts to actively exploit vulnerabilities to prove that they can be leveraged, that they are in fact exploitable. You have 3 testing teams, really 2 testing teams and a collaboration within the organization. You have the red team. This is offense. These are the attackers who simulate real-world threats to test resilience. There's the blue team, defense, the defenders, the internal security team responsible for detection and mitigation. And then we have the purple team, so named because red and blue, when mixed together, create purple. A cooperative exercise where the red and blue teams work together to improve security. So the purple team is process improvement. So let's talk about external testing. So this simulates an attack from outside the network perimeter, like from the internet, for example. Internal testing simulates an attack from within the perimeter, assuming a breach or a malicious insider. There's blind testing, where the tester is provided with limited or no knowledge of the target system. And then there is double-blind testing, where neither the tester nor the target's IT or security staff are aware of the test. In fact, virtually nobody within the organization has any awareness other than perhaps senior management that arranged this test. So the folks within the organization didn't know it was coming, so we have a more realistic test of their readiness and response. So from an auditor's perspective, note that the double-blind is the most effective way to test the organization's incident handling and response capability in a realistic fashion. There's targeted testing, where the IT team and testers are aware of the test and they're working together. This is sometimes known as lights-on testing. From an exam perspective, know that as an auditor, you must verify that documented prior approval from senior management exists for any penetration test. Without it, technically that test is an illegal act. So let's talk about the different application security testing techniques, starting with static application security testing. This is where the application's source code is analyzed without executing it. This finds flaws early in the software development lifecycle, This is sometimes called white box testing. There's dynamic application security testing, which tests the application while it's running with no knowledge of the internal code. So no source code access. This is called black box testing. So it's sometimes said that static application security testing tests the application from the inside out, and dynamic testing tests the application from the outside in. There's interactive application security testing. So this is a hybrid approach that uses an agent inside the running application to get more accurate results, sometimes called gray box testing, but it's testing the running application and looking at code execution at the same time. And then software composition analysis, which identifies and analyzes open source components used in an application to find known vulnerabilities, to make sure that we are using up-to-date and secure open source components and libraries. All right, that brings us to Section 4, Security Monitoring, Tools, and Techniques. So here we're going to talk about IDS, IPS, and the SIM. So the Security Operations Center is where many of these tools are used. It's a centralized team that constantly monitors the IT infrastructure to detect, analyze, and respond to security incidents. So tools they'll use will include intrusion detection systems that monitor for malicious activity and produce alerts. It's a detective control. It's really kind of like a burglar alarm. It tells you someone broke in, but it doesn't actually stop them. And then we have an intrusion prevention system, which can detect malicious activity often in the very same way, but it takes automated action to block or prevent the intrusion. It is a preventive control. So it's like a security guard who sees the intruder and stops them at the door. And then we have a Security Information and Event Management System, or SIM, which aggregates and correlates log data from a variety of sources, from many security services, systems, applications, our network devices, and analyzes those to identify security incidents. So its function is really to turn large amounts of raw log data into actionable intelligence, and often standardizing that data to a common schema so we can query across that data all at once. Next we have honeypots and honeynets. So a honeypot is a decoy system. It's designed to lure attackers in by appearing to be a legitimate vulnerable target. It's not actively protecting the network. It's a tool to gather intelligence on attacker methods and to serve as an early warning system. And a honeynet is essentially a linked set of multiple honeypots that simulate a larger, more realistic network for attackers to interact with. So from an auditor's perspective, you're evaluating their use as detective and intelligence gathering tools. We have to consider the risk that the honeypot could be used by an attacker to launch attacks against other systems. So this considers the reputational risk if external services identify and publicize the vulnerable system as well. So from an intrusion detection and prevention perspective, an auditor should evaluate the IDS and IPS implementation against established best practices. There are a couple of checklists here. So key audit checklist items would include an asset inventory. Is there a complete inventory of assets to determine what needs to be monitored? Remember, we can't protect what the organization doesn't know they have. Policy. Is there a formal documented policy for the IDS, IPS that defines the rules and the compliance requirements? Baselining. Has a baseline of normal network behavior been established to support anomaly detection in the first place? Placement. Are sensors placed correctly to provide adequate visibility? So do we have sensors at the network perimeter, in the DMZ, etc.? Tuning. Is the system regularly tuned to update rules and reduce false positives to make sure that the alerts we're getting are actionable? And incident response. Is there a documented incident response plan linked to IDS and IPS alerts? Okay, that brings us to number 5 in our syllabus, Security Incident Response Management. So at the most basic level, incident management includes events, which are just any observable item. This could include routine actions like a user successfully logging into a system. Incidents, by contrast, are events that are unplanned and have an adverse impact on the organization. So all incidents should be investigated and remediated to restore the organization's normal operations and to minimize that adverse impact. Not all incidents will require the security team, but security is the focus of this discussion. And the dedicated team responsible for executing the incident response plan from an ISACA perspective is the Computer Security Incident Response Team, or CSIRT. So let's take a look at the incident response lifecycle. And if you look at the official review manual, they really point to the NIST flavor of incident response, which includes preparation, detection and analysis, containment, eradication and recovery, and post-incident activity. So this life cycle is defined in NIST Special Publication 800-61 Rev 2, Computer Security Incident Handling Guide. You will not be required to memorize that standard. I simply wanted to cite for you where it was sourced from. And a mature organization will have a well-documented and regularly tested incident response plan. We notice that theme of documented and tested throughout the ISACA domains for the CISA exam. So let's talk about that incident response plan. So we know it needs to be a documented and tested plan that outlines procedures for handling a security incident, and that life cycle includes preparation, so establishing the tools, the team, that computer security incident response team, and procedures before we have an incident, so we know how we're going to respond before the incident comes. Detection and analysis, so identifying that an incident has occurred and then assessing the scope of that incident so we can contain the incident. So containment is going to be the next step, where we isolate affected systems, we remove the threat and restore normal operations. So containment, we're limiting the impact. Eradication, removing the threat, and recovery, restoring normal operations. And then post-incident activity. This is the lessons learned review. And generally speaking, this is considered the most important step for improving future security. Okay, that brings us to Section 6, Evidence Collection and Forensics. So you should be familiar with the different types of investigations, and the type of investigation dictates the rules of engagement, the burden of proof, and potential outcomes. So we have administrative investigations that focus on policy violations internally, employee conduct essentially. Criminal investigations are law enforcement led, and they follow strict legal procedures for court evidence. There are civil investigations related to lawsuits and gathering evidence for liability, typically related to monetary damages. And then regulatory investigations ensure compliance with laws or regulations like HIPAA, GDPR, or PCI DSS. Let me give you a reference table here so you have a snapshot of those different types of investigations, as well as the burden of proof, which in a criminal investigation is beyond a reasonable doubt. In a civil investigation, it's a preponderance of the evidence. So in a criminal trial, if you have a jury, it has to be unanimous and no doubt. In a civil trial, often it's just a majority of the jury. But that'll focus on monetary damages like intellectual property theft. So from an auditor's perspective, we need to think about computer forensics, that process of collecting, preserving, analyzing, and presenting digital evidence in a manner that is legally admissible. So you don't have to be an expert forensic investigator. You just need to understand the best practices and the guidelines for effective computer forensics so you can assess the organization's implementation. Your role is really just to ensure the organization has a formal documented process for forensic investigations and that they are executing that effectively. You verify the process, you don't perform the forensics as an auditor. So the phases of computer forensics, you want to be familiar with these because you're looking for a structured process. First, the initial actions taken by the team, the first response. evidence collection and seizure, so gathering potential evidence and securing devices. We always want to make sure that they're gathering from volatile sources first, such as running memory or network connections, anything that's going to disappear over time or with a reboot of a system. Then there's data acquisition, so creating forensic images of data, the bit-by-bit image creation. Data analysis, examining the acquired data for evidence, and then documentation and reporting, so documenting all findings for potential legal proceedings. So the most important concept when it comes to computer forensics is the chain of custody. If you remember nothing else from this section for the exam, the chain of custody is the one thing you should remember. This is a detailed, chronological document that tracks the handling of evidence from the moment of collection to its presentation in court. Every change of hands and when it changed hands and why it changed hands. The purpose is to prove the integrity of the evidence and to show that it has not been tampered with or altered in any way. So the focus is on integrity. So what it tracks who had access to the evidence and when, where the evidence was stored, what procedures were performed on the evidence. So what sort of investigative activities were performed, and how the evidence was transferred between individuals or locations. So know for the exam that a broken or incomplete chain of custody is one of the most common reasons that digital evidence is ruled inadmissible in a court of law. Any break in the chain of custody, that evidence is going to be thrown out by a judge. So a few forensic audit considerations. So an auditor must verify that the organization's forensic procedures follow established best practices. Some key principles here that you'll want to remember. So from a data acquisition perspective, never work on original evidence. All analysis must be done on a bit-by-bit copy of that image, what we call a forensic copy, which includes on a drive, for example, all of the data, but all of the empty space, which may include remnants of deleted data. And you'll use write blockers during imaging to prevent altering the original disk. So it's going to be write locked. And oftentimes they'll use what we call a worm drive, or write once, read many. So volatile data, we want to make sure we don't change the power state of the device. So if it's on, it needs to be left on to preserve volatile data like RAM content or network connection information, which may be critical to an investigation. Then there's verification. So using cryptographic hashes like a secure hash algorithm to verify that the forensic image is an exact, unaltered copy of the original. Again, integrity is the prime directive here. So key takeaways for Domain 5B for exam day. Differentiate the following key concepts. So awareness versus training versus education. So moving from the most shallow to the deepest form of knowledge transfer there. Vulnerability scan versus penetration test and the types of penetration tests we discussed. Static versus dynamic application security testing. Intrusion detection versus intrusion prevention. The SIM solution, and we talked about SOAR earlier in the series. So SIM is where we're aggregating our log data and analyzing activity for potential incidents. SOAR, security orchestration and automated response, that's where we are automating the response to potential incidents. We talked about honeypots and honeynet versus intrusion prevention, which is actually preventing an attack. So honeypots are not active protection where IPS is active protection. And incident response. Remember that a plan is useless unless it is documented and tested. Those are the keys. And remember, forensics from an auditor's perspective is about process. Your primary concerns are the chain of custody and the preservation of original evidence. It's all about integrity and that chain of custody. Your job as an auditor is to evaluate the process, not perform the task. And my friends, that's what I have for you here in Domain 5, Part B. And that brings us to the end of our series. So as you make those final preparations for exam day, if you have any questions, drop them here in the comments, ping me on LinkedIn. Happy to help anywhere I can. And I will wish you the best of luck on exam day. Make sure you come back and tell me how exam day goes for you. And until next time, take care and stay safe.